Go into a little bit of your life story and your career, of obviously very fun facts about you. And we're also going to go into dorm room fund and the inception story. I think maybe we start there for a minute here because, of course, to get to backing 300 companies, it has to start somewhere.
That's right.
And it's spun out of a firm you've previously worked at.
That's right.
So how did you come up with the ideas? Who are the supporters behind it?
Yeah. So I can only take partial credit because Dorm Room Fund actually started before I got there. So back in 2012, Josh Koppelman, who's the founder of First Round Capital, came up with the idea for Dorm Room Fund. And he himself had been a founder when he was a student at Penn. Started a company right at sort of the early days of the internet. It's something he took public, and if you look at the partnership at First Round, there's just been this like deep tie to university ecosystems, and many of them started their companies there. And so I think one day Josh was sort of sitting around and going like, hey, wait a minute. So if I look at the, even just the top 10 companies that have been founded on or very near or from dropouts of university ecosystems, we're talking about blockbuster companies, right? We're talking about obviously famously Facebook, but Microsoft, Google, right? Dell. Bet you didn't know FedEx was a university-started company. So if you add all those up, it's trillions of dollars in enterprise value. And so, we know that there's this, unfair advantage that universities give to founders who want to start companies, right? There's access to talent, there's time to build, there's places to build, there's resources, there's cutting-edge research. And so especially when we have these moments of massive technological change, it opens up, it sort of levels the playing field and opens up this opportunity for people on university campuses to start really, really cool things and get a lot of support building. So it was originally a hypothesis that Josh and team sort of wanted to test out. The first time they did it, the sort of insight that they had that was really unusual for the time was, well, if these students are starting these awesome companies, then certainly students can also find these awesome companies, right? And so the thesis was, how do we find these great folks before the mainstream does? And so, the insight there was, well, let's find a bunch of really connected students, give them the tools and the training that they need to go out and figure out what sort of makes a venture-backable company, and let's give them the guidance and the support to help find the best stuff on their campuses before anybody else. And so what started as a crazy idea has grown.
So we're going to talk much more about the inception story to now, but to go backward a little bit now, you did not start as a venture capitalist.
No. I feel like venture is full of people who ended up in venture by accident. I think it's only really like in recent years that there's become like a career path into VC, and I think Dorm Room Fund actually has played a role there, but. No, I started my career in political campaigns, which, and the little ones too. I wasn't working on the Bloomberg campaign or anything that big. I was doing these little, a city council race in a Southern California town, a congressional race in California, and, ended up on the mayor's race in LA. And I loved it. I loved it because I loved it that it was so scrappy and you were starting from nothing and you had to build your team and you had no money and you had to raise it and manage your burn and figure out who your users are and your candidate's your product. And so I think you guys are probably getting a sense, but it's basically, startups, the sort of core DNA of startups. And so what I loved about political campaigns, I realized I could do over and over and over and over again in that 0 to 1 motion as an early stage investor. And so I've really loved that.
So before I forget as well, you guys all will also have a chance to ask questions to Molly, and so at the end I will open up the questions for her as well. But so what did you take over from the public sector to the private sector? At what point were you like, let's go do venture capital instead?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't like a clear like, aha, like tomorrow I'm going to go to venture. It was really a bunch of different discoveries, right? I mean, it started with, oh, I really love this 0 to 1 motion on political campaigns, right? And so it was like one campaign to another one to a bigger one. And then I was like, okay, well now I want to see like what the government side is. And in retrospect, what I realized is that that's kind of the Series A moment, right?
When you worked for Eric Garcetti.
That's right, yeah.
You went from the campaign to
the governing, yeah, with the candidate that won the race. And I was like, oh, this is really interesting because it's like you've sort of figured out your structure, and there's, rules to the road, and you've got more capital to put to work, and so it's really about expanding your access. And so that was sort of a really interesting time to learn. And as part of my policy portfolio for Mayor Garcetti, I had the tech ecosystem in LA, and so we were doing a bunch of really cool projects, including working with Google Fiber in their early attempts to bring fiber to the city of Los Angeles. And that was I'm dating myself a little bit, but we realized how hard it was to do with public dollars. And I actually, through a bunch of different sort of introductions and through the CTO of the city of LA, I got introduced to this company in New York that was trying to solve a similar problem, but with a private sector model. And so that led me to a sort of growth stage startup that I joined here in New York, came back. I'm an East Coaster, so it was an exciting opportunity for me to come back from California, and worked on the private side for a while, and then sort of realized one day, had done a few things and done the market launcher thing, and I was like, okay, I'm seeing the parallels here. And I'm realizing that just like political campaigns have the donors, right? No matter how good your candidate is, if you can't raise any money, you can't win your race, right? Unfortunately. Or fortunately, depending on how you feel about it. But in startup land, it's so similar, right? If you have a fantastic product, but you don't get the right backers, it's much, much, much harder to win. And so I was really interested in seeing how do the mechanics on that side work. And so that was an exciting moment when I got the call from First Round to come run Dorm Room Fund, which was then a part of First Round Capital.
So before we even get there, what were the overlaps? It's interesting to say you were kind of exposed in that way to technology while you worked for the mayor's office. I mean, where else did you see the crossover?
Yeah, look, I also think it was a really interesting time to be in government because I think it was a heyday of GovTech. I would say it was sort of a GovTech wave. I don't know if it was 1.0 or 2.0, but some of the big projects we worked on in the mayor's office in 2013 to 2015 was it was when Waze was first showing up, and so they wanted to license city data, and how are we going to handle that? And there were all these privacy concerns, and so we were dealing with that. We were seeing how much the technology and startup ecosystem was driving new job creation in the mayor's office. So we were looking at that. We were watching sort of modernization of the port happening, and so that was just in that ecosystem. You think about, and we would see, the tech ecosystem was such a big part of the Santa Barbara world that I was operating in even before that. And so I think it was this moment where you realize it's not a sector. It's really just, it touches everything that we do. And so it's so embedded into all of the companies that we run, but our governments and how we operate and how we elect our candidates and all of that good stuff. So I think, and one thing led to another, and then realizing that it was something that I wanted to do full time.
It's very funny you mentioned this. As you were in LA, I was actually in Chicago at that time.
Oh, really?
Rahm Emanuel.
Yes.
I saw him more at the startup incubator there than most other places in the city.
Yep.
So it's very, very relatable, that story. So when you then crossed over, you started talking about your time at First Round Capital. First observation, wondering what was your biggest difference at that point between East Coast and West Coast tech? You were so excited to be back.
Yeah. I don't think I had not really been a part of the San Francisco scene when I was in California, and so I think I really wasn't that steeped in what I would call mainstream West Coast technology world. But and I also think that when I landed in New York, I was working for a company called Intersection, which was actually part of the Sidewalk Labs, sort of ecosystem, and I was working directly with the Sidewalk Labs team, and what we were working on was, government-style infrastructure for cities that was tech-enabled, and so I think I was still in that sort of GovTech, hard tech ecosystem, and so I think it really wasn't until I got to First Round that I got to start to really see the broader picture. And it was funny because the way I ended up there, they tried to hire my friend, actually. Thank God for Sarah. And Sarah was like, he was for this role at First Round, and she was like, oh, I'm busy, I got this great job I love, but you should talk to my friend Molly. And they gave me a ring, and it was, and we talked for a long time, and they got to know me and what I was good at, and they were like, well, you're not right for this role, but have you ever thought about running dorm room fund? And I was like, well, no, I've never thought about running dorm room fund, but what is it? And so I went and learned about it, and I realized that it sort of mapped really well, so much of the operations of the fund mapped so well to the things I had done as a political campaign, sort of field director. And I said to them, I was like, I would love to do this, but I want to be crystal clear. I know nothing about venture capital. And they were like, we can teach you, right? So I think that was really the gift that I was given at that stage, which is that I got to really learn the ropes with some of the best seed investors in the world. And so, I basically would be running dorm room fund during the day and sitting in Bill Trenchard's pitches at night, one of the partners at First Round, and getting to sit in the First Round partnership meetings and seeing what they were seeing. And so it was a really, accelerated boot camp of learning what was going on in the ecosystem. And I think now it's been really interesting to see how what I learned then has already morphed so much in terms of, how New York is positioned in the tech world versus San Francisco, and how that's changed even just in the last 5 years.
So is there a benefit then to not being kind of in that main San Francisco circle?
Well, I do think that's interesting. I've never thought about it as a benefit. I think it's different, right? I think when you go to San Francisco, you literally can't spin around in a circle with your arm out and not hit somebody who's building a tech company, right? And it feels to me at least like the social ecosystem there is just so singularly about tech and about whatever's popular and AI and da da da. And so, and I think it also changes the game because there's just so much venture capital there. You think about how the ecosystem has changed. I mean, venture has just exploded over the last 10 years, especially. And when First Round started their fund in 2004, seed investing wasn't even a thing, right? And now it's like you go out to San Francisco and you hit a VC no matter where you go, right? It's hard to find a place to have a private conversation. Here in New York, we're not a one-company town, right? And so I think the benefit for that is that there's a little bit less myopic sort of tendencies towards this is what success look like, and this is the area that I'm building in, and these are the people that I need to raise from. I think we do get to pull from other ecosystems in a way that maybe doesn't happen quite the same. But I also think there's downsides. I think if you are an early stage founder, it's probably a little harder to raise here than it is in San Francisco, just because there's just fewer dollars floating around. I think that's evening out over time, and I think more and more you're seeing less of a distinction between East Coast, West Coast in terms of early stage. But
so when you were kind of making the transition here, you made this joke about how they'll teach you.
Yeah.
So what was the biggest learning curve, and what can other people maybe learn from that?
Yeah, I mean, people always ask what's the hardest part of venture capital, being in VC, and I really think for me the hardest part, especially at the beginning, was saying no to businesses that should exist but that just weren't venture scalable, right? And I think it was a really important lesson for me as a VC, and something I still think a lot about. And I think it's also a really important thing for founders to learn. Because I think especially in the ecosystem that we've found ourselves in and the environment we found ourselves in today, where the number of VCs has just proliferated, right, to the point where there's so much, it's still, to be clear, a gnat on, an elephant of private equity, but still the dollars in VC have ballooned, and so it's a lot easier to get VC funding. And I think you saw, especially in 2021, things went crazy, and things that shouldn't have been venture funded got venture funding and all that stuff. But I think it's really important as a VC and as a founder to understand venture capital is a product, and it's not for everyone. And so making sure the company that you're building is best served by that product. It doesn't mean your company is or isn't a success. It just means that is or is not the right sort of tool for you, right?
So there was a choice after you joined First Round and started working with the Dorm Room Fund to spin out Dorm Room Fund.
Yeah. Go ahead, finish your question. Yeah.
What has that done for you? Why was that choice made, and what does it let you do?
Yeah, it was a little crazy, to be quite honest. I mean, I could sit here and tell you that it was all my idea, but the truth is that I like to joke that Josh Koppelman incepted me a little bit, because after he and I had the sort of like, well, we could spin it out conversation, I then went back and realized that at the end of the blog post announcing Dorm Room Fund, at the very last sentence, he writes, "We hope one day the Dorm Room Fund will be its own VC, its own separate fund." So hopefully I feel like we sort of took the fated step for DRF. But I think really what was going on is that we had built this experiment, right, which had started with just a dozen students in Philadelphia and like $500,000 to see like, hey, if we arm these super smart students, and with the help they need, dollars, can we find the best stuff early? And it grew and grew and grew, and then over time, it grew from Philadelphia to New York to Boston to San Francisco, and then in 2020 we took it national, right? So then we had students all over the country.
During the pandemic.
Yes, yeah, huge opportunity there, and we can talk about that for sure. But I think long story short is that we had enough years under our belt at that point to realize that the model was working, right? We were finding amazing companies, but what we hadn't really been paying attention to was like the mechanics of a venture fund, right? You need to put dollars to work. You need to have ownership. You need to, think about your venture model, right? At the time, it was almost like a sourcing experiment for first round, right? Then the performance of the fund was almost an afterthought. But, what we realized is that these funds were knocking it out of the park, and we were finding really incredible companies. And so really the desire to spin out was the opportunity for us to put more capital to work in a winning strategy. And we knew that would be a benefit for our founders, because we could write much more meaningful checks for them at the earliest stages, for the students on the team who were going to be exposed to an even broader network, and frankly for our alumni who were graduating from the Dorm Room Fund program and going on to be founders themselves and VCs, and they had been doing this for 8 years. And so we have like senior people at places, Talia Goldberg at Bessemer is a Dorm Room Fund alum, and Anjane Mita at Andreessen is a Dorm Room Fund alum. So we have all these incredible people. And so when it was just inside of first round, we kind of had to be a little sharp-elbowed. But once we spun out and we're independent, there's all this opportunity to take advantage of this ecosystem and this network that we've built. And so it really was a leap of faith, but there were so many good things behind it that I really wanted to try it.
I want to talk more about that alumni network in a second as well, but let's talk about 2020 for a second.
Yeah.
It sounds like that was one pivotal moment.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, how exactly did it allow you to expand nationally at that time? And is there anything you learned from doing business at that time that's kind of held over?
Yeah. I feel like when you talk to people, everyone either had a really great pandemic or a really terrible pandemic. I mean, obviously it was horrible and millions of people died, and like it's objectively terrible, but the sort of like stay at home for those of us that were lucky enough to not lose someone and be healthy, it was this real crucible moment, I think, for a lot of people. And I think Dorm Room Fund had a really great pandemic. And I think it was a couple of factors. I think the first is that so many students found themselves at home and sort of under-engaged for the first time. And so we saw founder applications to Dorm Room Fund shoot through the roof, right? Like literally everybody was building. And so there was just this sense of like possibility and opportunity there that was like sort of a bright side of this really horrible time. And the other thing that was sort of interesting is that because we were all operating remotely, it sort of took off the rules a little bit for some of the ways that we had been operating as a team for so long. Historically, Dorm Room Fund, in order to be a member of the team, you had to be physically in the city that the team met in, right? And so, here in New York, it meant that we had folks from Columbia and Barnard and, NYU and Cornell Tech, and we even had folks that would come down from Cornell's main campus every week just to be on the Dorm Room Fund team, right? Which was kind of wild, and I see Nigel's in the audience, so he can confirm. But what it meant is that we were really constraining ourselves to, because the best part of our model is that the students on the ground see the best stuff first. And so what that meant was there were all of these amazing universities that were having these incredible startup renaissances that like we weren't able to access. And so I think what happened with the pandemic is that everyone was working from home, and we were learning how to operate as a sort of hybrid institution. And so we realized that it was an opportunity for us to jump in and sort of expand to some of the universities that we had long wanted to be at, but sort of hadn't had the infrastructure to do it. And so, we expanded to the Midwest. We added folks in the Southeast, like at Georgia Tech, and we've got a Georgia Tech Dorm Room Fund alum in the audience. We went to Texas for the first time. We went to Seattle. And so it sort of was an experiment that showed us that there is so much happening even outside of those four core cities, that it was worth us sort of making an adjustment to the way we operated.
Have you found a big difference between how these campuses operate and the types of entrepreneurs they tend to breed?
Oh, yeah, huge. I mean, it's, part of it is the infrastructure, right? So one thing that's been amazing to see over the last 5 years is just the arms race that's happening on university campuses. And I don't just mean at the collegiate level. I also mean the business schools and the master's in computer science programs and the PhD programs, that these universities are spending so much money to create these incredible entrepreneurship ecosystems, right? And that's great. And I think that means that there's more CS majors, and I think that means that there's more talented people running around. But I think the thing that you can't sort of manufacture, and I think the thing that you see at some of these schools is that there is just a culture around starting companies, right? And so part of the reason that Stanford is what it is just that, like, if you want to start a company, you go to Stanford, right? And that's true for Stanford's graduate school too, right? And so there just is this ethos on campus where it's like everyone's sort of building and tinkering, and you see that other places. I think MIT is another great example of that. And so, it's a slightly different challenge for us at those schools, because instead of looking for people who are building, we have to discern between people who are building and serious about it versus building, for a class project or something before they go back to McKinsey after business school, So it's really, I think it's so much driven by the culture, and that's why we as a group we tend not to rely on those institutional sort of startup organizations, because we tend to find that a lot of the great founders are sort of off the grid and still building in their dorm rooms, and that's why we like to find them the way we do it.
So talk more about how you're finding students. I mean, what are the ingredients of a great entrepreneur?
Yeah, great question. We at DRF are investing pre-seed and sometimes even pre-seed, right? And which is kind of crazy, but we're investing at the stage when a founder has a problem that they've just become completely obsessed with. And one of the cool things that we're doing is merely making a bet on the founder. And so that question about what makes a fantastic entrepreneur is really a good one. I think, a couple of things I would say are sort of on the top of my hit list. The first is that they're solving a problem that really matters to them personally, right? There's a lot of I think becoming a founder has become a bit trendy these days. And so there are more and more sort of tourist founders. And so you really want to find folks that are solving problems that they care deeply about. And it doesn't mean that it's a personal problem for them. It can be just something they're obsessed with, right? I'm obsessed with this team out of Penn who got really interested in this ancient Japanese fish slaughtering technique that preserves the fish meat for 10x longer because the fish isn't stressed when it dies, and it doesn't just essentially drown on the commercial fishing vehicle. And they're not fishermen, right? But they just got obsessed with this idea, and now they're doing incredibly well, and in the process of doing some really exciting stuff on the fundraising side, but and hopefully could change the face of commercial fishing, right? So it doesn't have to be a personal problem, but it's a problem that they really care about and are deeply interested in, and sort of obsessed by. I think there has to be, to borrow from Mike Maples, there has to be an insight, right? So that founder has to know something different than everybody else, or see the world a little bit differently, because one thing, we're less excited about is oh, it's a cool idea, but we've seen 17 other versions of that, right? And then I think the third thing, and this is something I sort of borrowed from the first round crew, from Bill and Josh, is looking for founders that have gotten off the conveyor belt a little bit. Like, I think in a lot of ways, the U.S. education system can be a little bit of a conformity machine. Like, there are certain ways to be successful, right? And I think you really feel this, like, business school is a classic example of this, where everybody wants to go be the consultant or the banker, or now I guess it's VC. But, you want to look for people that did weird stuff, that, like, sort of just got off the
What are some examples of that?
Yeah, like, starting their own. I love when I see people that, like, started their own organization from scratch because they didn't feel served by, what was available to them, either, on campus or whatever. Or I love when I see, like, Dorm Room Fund is littered with people who, started their own shoe business out of their trunk when they were in high school. Or, like, we have a member of the team who runs ultra marathons, right? Or, like, people who just, like, who aren't sort of doing all the cookie cutter things that you're supposed to do to be successful in sort of our culture, but they end up doing really interesting and successful things because they're a little different.
Well, speaking of, when do you have time to be a sommelier and or however you say it, right?
Yeah.
And a country singer?
I mean, I think people need to have passions outside of work. I mean, hopefully you love what you're doing, right? And, like, Dorm Room Fund is a huge part of my identity. But, like, I don't know. I can speak for the Dorm Room Fund community. We're all big nerds. And so, like, it's good to have other places to put all that, like, creative, competitive energy. And so for me, it's, I studied opera in college. And so country singing.
Opera to country is a big.
Yeah, it's less weird to get up in a bar and sing country than it is to get up and sing an aria. So maybe I'm just, like, socially acceptable versions of my old loves. But, and the sommelier thing, I mean, I actually think there's probably some similarities between growing and making wine and, like, growing and starting interesting businesses, because it's like they're all the same pieces, right? Like, it's all the same units, but, grapes and dirt and sun and wood aging casks make so many different versions of things depending on all the little pieces and decisions you make along the way. And so that's the really interesting thing about wine to me. And so I think that's also sort of, there's AWS instances and, ChatGPT and but if you use all of those things and tinker with them a little bit differently, the outcome can be so very different.
So success stories then. Let's talk about, okay, we talked a little about how you find an entrepreneur, but now what do those entrepreneurs become?
Oh my God, yeah, it's the coolest thing. I mean, it's truly the coolest thing. I mean, I feel like the sort of really top of mind example for me right now is that we're really lucky. Let me start off by saying we're really lucky because Dorm Room Fund has become a little bit of a household name on some of these campuses. And so we are incredibly lucky to get to choose just, like, some really amazing people to join the team as investors. And what's really interesting is that the students on our student investing team don't all go off and become VCs. A lot of them want to join the team so that they can learn what it's like to sit on the other side of the table, so that when they go and build later, that it makes them a better founder. And so what's really interesting is how many of those folks have been successful. And so, like, Tony Loco, who was on the team when I joined Dorm Room Fund in 2019 at Penn undergrad, I got to know Tony so early in his career, and we were one of Tony's very first investors when he started his company, and it was like this crazy idea, and he was a brand new brand new founder and learning how to do all this stuff, and lo and behold, like, Tony now, Tony's company Dandy has grown to be, like a $2.5 billion enterprise, and he's completely changed the face of modern dentistry, and it's just, like, really incredible to have been a part of that journey. And another great example of that is Michael Truel. So Michael was on our team when he was an undergrad at MIT. I always knew Michael would build something interesting. And a year after he graduated from school, he came to me and he said, "Hey, I'm building this crazy idea. I think it's kind of cool. I have a really great founder, a co-founder. Would you help me bring together my pre-seed round?" And I was like, "Oh my God, would love that, right? Here's 10 people to talk to. Also, can we invest?" And lo and behold, now Michael just announced he raised his Series A over the summer at a 400 million post, and he's building Cursor, which is like changing the way, developers are coding. And so it's been really amazing to see that journey of these like really young, especially the undergrads that really hit it. There's plenty of folks in our portfolio that are amazing business school students and PhD founders and things like that. But like especially to see the undergrads who really knock the cover off the ball, it's a really amazing thing to witness.
Well, in a year or in a season, you can choose your time horizon. But how many investments do you take a look at, and how many applications do you get?
Yeah. So this year we had about 1,200 students apply to Dorm Room Fund to join the team. We took about 30. And so folks who join the team spend at least 2 years with us, because we like to have folks around. So we never have more than half the team graduating at any one time. So you can do the math. That means that our acceptance rate is lower than a lot of the schools all of the schools that these folks are applying from. So we have some it's the best part of my job. I get to work with the smartest people in the world. So that's pretty amazing. From an investing perspective, we see many multiples of that, right? And we end up investing, I'd say, somewhere between 20 and 30 companies a year. But we see many thousands, some of whom come into us inbound, some of whom the students are out meeting, some of whom we get introduced to by our founders or by the alumni community. And we at this point also similarly get the privilege of being very, very picky. And we don't always get it right. There's some really awesome companies that we said no to. GoPuff, before my time, but we saw GoPuff really early and said no, and boy, was that a mistake. But we've also backed some really amazing game-changing companies as well. So it's been amazing.
So in this last part of the interview, and then we'll open up to questions, let's talk about the environment writ large.
For sure.
Because a lot is changing. The IPO market has been in a challenging place. So when you start, you were saying sometimes in pre-seed round, how do you think through the time horizon and how these companies will grow into the future and where they're supposed to end up in this great confusing land of capital markets?
Oh my God, it's unhinged what we're expecting people to do, right? I mean, you deal with, investors all day long who, would never dream of locking up their capital for 12 or 14 years, right? But that's what we do all day long at DRF because we're investing at the earliest stages. And for those in the audience who are not venture investors, the only time that VCs get their money back is when companies get acquired or go public or hopefully not shut down, and usually then you don't get any money back. And so your capital's locked up for a really long time, and that horizon is even longer when you're getting in at pre-seed, right? And so as a result, we need to deliver mind-numbingly spectacular outcomes in terms of multiples on the capital invested to make up for that sort of time money question. And so, one interesting thing that's there and that's true and that's always true. But one interesting thing that's happening right now is, and I'm sure you see this a lot at work, Sonali, is that the exit markets have really changed, right? We saw sort of this steady growth in terms of IPO and VC exit valuation over the years until about 2021 when we hit this like crazy spike, right? And the PitchBook data says it was about $700 billion in 2021 worth of companies that went public or had an exit. And then for the 2 years after that, it's been closer to like 60, 70, $80 billion a year, which is much more on par with what it was in the early 2000s or sort of late aughts, early 2010s. And so, there's a question, which is, everybody in VC was like, oh, it's okay. The markets will bounce back. Like more companies will go public. We're going to return to normal, right? But the question is like, for so many funds, especially the ones that got started in 2021, was that normal? Or are we seeing what a new normal is, right? And so when you do the math behind a venture fund, in order for you to get those astronomical exits, you need the companies to exit for a lot of money. And at sort of peak of the market, you were seeing 10, 20 more X multiples on revenue. And so the question is like, can the market sustain all the dollars that are in venture today, right? And similarly, there's a question around, you know, does the venture model have to change and evolve to sort of adjust for the new normal, right?
Well, one other part of the new normal that's interesting, and this is from Bloomberg's own interview with Morgan Stanley CEO just about a week or two ago, and he does a lot of IPOs at that company. They're looking for the next set of IPOs, and they keep saying that they're going to get bigger and bigger. That could mean that you have to go public later and later. You pair that with the fact that you have half the amount of public companies now than you did in the 1990s, and so on and so forth. So what does it mean for you to be investing in companies at such young a phase if they're waiting longer to go public and need to be so large when they do?
It's, you know, it's an interesting question. It's one I talk about with my limited partners, my investors, all the time, right? Because especially right now, what's happening in the LP market is that everybody went crazy in 2021, right, and backed all of these funds. And now all of those funds are coming back to market and saying, hey, I'm raising fund 2, or I'm raising whatever the next fund is, fund 3,
valuations were high then.
Right, exactly. That supported it. But the challenge is valuations went up, but DPI didn't follow, right? So the actual dollars in hand returned to the investors. And so what's really interesting is that you have these institutional investors who are counting on returns in order to allow them to invest in the next fund. And so we've seen the capital markets, like the venture capital market, the capital's still locked up, right? And so it's been harder for LPs to do new funds, and so you're seeing people like raising smaller funds. So it's a really interesting thing. And so the other thing that you're starting to see in venture is people thinking more creatively about what getting DPI, or dollars to paid in capital, which is like the ultimate metric in VC. Like, how do you get more cash exits before those public exits, right? The goal is that you have fantastic investors who are happy to be patient capital with you and are along for the ride, right? But then there's also investors who need some cash back on a shorter than 12-year timeline, right? And so it's making us think about, I imagine that the secondary market has already picked up, and I think it will continue to be a really important part of our strategy. I think one nice thing for Dorm Room Fund is that we get in so early, and we've been along the ride with the founder for so long, and we're not a lead investor. So if we need to take a little off the table, it's like a little less painful maybe than it could be for some of the lead investors. But I think we all need to be creative about, what does success look like, and being realistic about the timelines that we're working on.
Right, you asked this question, what needs to change, or if does something need to change? What needs to change, if anything?
I think either expectations from LPs need to change, which I think is probably unreasonable to expect, or VCs need to be more comfortable taking some off the table, is sort of the expression that we're
not in the go-go days anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you can't just go long forever, right? And so if I think a lot of responsible VCs will have especially in early funds when you're still sort of getting off the ground, which is where Dorm Room Fund is. We're really only in fund 2, raising fund 2. You need to be sort of willing to consider, having a policy in place, right? So that, like, okay, if we've hit 100x, like, we're gonna take half of the position off the table or something like that. And so secondaries, whether it's to another investor in the round or to, there's all these secondaries funds that have popped up. I think, like, just going long for the sake of going long is probably not going to be an option for everyone for always.
I also want to ask about what you're seeing in the market. Of course, you're a prominent woman in the space.
Yes.
In a
well,
space.
Prominent, I don't know, but woman, yes. Yeah.
That has traditionally been a space where women have found it difficult to raise money for businesses. Women and people of color. What are you finding as new entrepreneurs come up and the experience that they have in raising capital?
Yeah. So I think, first of all, I think as a woman, I feel like I stand on the shoulders of a generation of female VCs that preceded me that did the hardest work, right? So I think, like, Anne Miraco and Aileen Lee and, Kristen Green and those folks, like, when they did it, like, really nobody was a female VC. Like, that was just not a thing, right? And so, like, I think the generation of female VCs woman VCs that I'm a part of, we owe them a lot of thanks. And I think it is normalized to be a woman in venture at this point. Like, so many of my friends' funds are reaching out to me and they're like, hey, we're looking for talent, especially would be awesome if there were some women. So, I think it actually could be a little bit of a leg up at this moment. But I think the challenge remains for female founders. And the unfortunate and sort of sucky thing about that is that there's all this research to show that it doesn't matter who's on the other side of the table, that like women and people of color are asked questions in a format that sort of, it's an unconscious bias that happens even if you're a female or an investor of color, that, Dana Cons is the sort of social researcher that I think did some really amazing work on this, but there's promotional questions versus, and I'm forgetting the second language, but basically questions that like are guarding against downside. And so the bummer is that like they're seeing that sort of universally true for VCs across the table. But what's great about it is that one, you can read research about it and be more thoughtful about it. Two, I think the other thing that's happening is that like there really is a diversification of who is a VC that's happening now, and I think Dormer Fund has a role to play there, right? Because we're graduating 30 new students every year into the ecosystem, all of whom are coming to to these first venture jobs as like seasoned investors, right? And so we have the privilege of making sure that our team is representative of the country that we live in a really powerful way, which is exciting. I think the other thing is that there's a lot of capital these days, and unfortunately, some of the like post George Floyd dollars that were in venture that were sort of, I would say, like racial justice or for underrepresented managers, some of that has dried up, but the best ones have not, right? And so I think about like Plexo Capital, First Close Capital, First Close Partners rather. Insight has a Vision Fund 2020 fund, and so there are people, Recast Capital is another organization. There are funds and fund of funds that are looking specifically to back women and people of color and underrepresented managers in venture, because they know that this is a problem. And so I think like it's still incredibly hard, and there's so much work to be done, but I do feel a little bit hopeful about the mechanics that we've put in place and the sort of infrastructure that is being built out in the ecosystem that hopefully will start to turn the tide.
One more question for me, and then I'm going to open it up to all of you guys too. So you were talking about the ecosystem changing, the venture community really facing new exit challenges, if you will, valuation questions. When you talk to founders now, what is the biggest challenge they're going to face as they're building their companies, whether it's about the capital raising process or building a business that stands out?
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that I talk to, so Dormer Fund, we work specifically with university-based folks. So that means current students, recent graduates, recent dropouts, folks who have a connection to a university ecosystem. What that often means is that those are first-time founders, right? And so one of the ways that my teammate Maddie and I really support the founders that we work with is that we can help them do the fundraise thing for the first time, right? And there really is like, there's lessons to be learned, there's a dance to be done, there are rules, there are expectations, there's etiquette, right? And so sort of helping people navigate that process is something that I spend a lot of my day doing, and I think can make a really big impact on the success of the company in the long run. And sort of like we talked about with campaigns, it's like, even if your idea is awesome, if you don't get funded the right amount by the right people, you're in trouble, right? And so like I think what's been happening in this ecosystem, especially post 2021 and sort of during this AI boom that we're having, is that founders pay too much attention to post-money valuations. And they think that if they raise capital at this like massive valuation, that it will show that they're the winners and that their company is successful and set them up for future success forever, amen. And the truth is that it's a little bit of a devil's bargain, right? Because if you set yourself up such that you raise at this colossal valuation, and I think we saw this in 21 and are on the other side of it for some companies, you then set yourself up for the next round where you have these massive shoes to fill, right? Where you have to be this incredibly giant company that's pumping out this insane amount of revenue that will justify a then again like double or triple that valuation on the next round. And so I think, no one ever plans for their company to not perform well, right? But I think sometimes people get themselves in situations where they accidentally price themselves out of the market. And so I think, like, given where we are today, I think if that's one thing that I work really carefully with our founders on, and I think is something that I hope founders can sort of take to heart, which is that, don't let yourself be screwed out of equity, right? Like, you hopefully are only giving that equity away once, right? And it's your most valuable resource. But on the other hand, like, don't over-optimize for valuation in such a way that you sort of set yourself up for trouble in the long run.
It's a science and an art
Yeah.
at the same time. Okay, any questions from you guys? We'll take one here first.
So one of the things you talked about is that what you look for in a founder is what is the problem that they're passionate about and trying to solve.
Sure.
And I'm curious about the kinds of problems, and in those 20 to 30 companies, how many are a GoPuff, B2C? How many are a B2B, like the Japanese cutting the fish thing?
Yep, Shinkei systems.
And then how many perhaps are what I would call tech for good? UN global goals, purpose,
Sure.
but in the 20 to 30 in a year, can you tell us how many fall in those maybe not so greatly named buckets?
Sure. I think a misnomer or a commonly misunderstood or assumed fact about Dormer Fund is that because we work with students, we only do consumer companies, right? And that all we see is consumer companies all day long. The truth is that that's not really true. We see a lot of B2B, software. We see a lot of B2B companies that are building like really incredible things. And I think in today's world, especially with sort of what's happening in AI land, there is so much room for improvement in the B2B ecosystem that I think we probably see more of that than we do just about anything else. I will tell you, like, in terms of trends that we see on campus today, one of the best parts of interviewing hundreds of students every fall is that it's essentially like doing user research, right? It's the world's best user research. And so it gives me a little bit of a sense of like what students are interested in. And so I'm seeing a lot of vertical B2B SaaS. I'm seeing a lot of healthcare. I'm seeing a lot of deep tech and hard tech, right? Robotics. I'm seeing a lot of defense, right? There's an interest, I think, partly because of the geopolitical ecosystem we find ourselves in, but also partly because Andreessen has a fantastic marketing department, that there's this interest in the defense world. I think we're seeing a lot of cutting-edge research at some of these institutions around the use of robotics and biotech too, right? So I think that's where we're seeing a lot of activity at the DRF angle. I think the B2C is far less common, especially than it was probably in like 2018, 2019, when I think we saw a real B2C boom in venture. And I think you see across the ecosystem that there's a lot fewer VCs that are backing consumer companies, especially those that were sort of labeled D2C, right, direct to consumer. Those I think have fallen out of favor with a lot of VCs for the most part. So we don't do as much of that these days. In terms of social good, I mean, I think like one of the things that's most interesting about my job is that I work with university folks, right? And so there is a degree to which, Gen Z has some real values around sustainability, around climate, around like social good. And so I think especially climate, we're seeing a lot of companies that are focusing on not just, preserving the world and making it possible for us to live in a beautiful ecosystem for longer, but I think also recognizing that there's a huge business opportunity there, right? That there is sort of no bigger business problem that we face as a planet than some of these climate challenges. And so we see a lot in that space as well.
Any other questions? There's one right here. I'm going to go back next.
Thank you for speaking with us today.
Yeah.
I guess you sort of touched on my question a little bit in previous answers about timelines and also like the little dance that you teach these entrepreneurs. But do you feel that there are certain unique risks that are associated with working with student entrepreneurs specifically?
Sure. Yeah. I think like, first of all, as I said, there is a higher proportion of first-time founders in our community, right? And experience matters, right? I think like even if you've started something small and failed at it and come back and started a company again, even if you're still a recent grad, I think there's some lessons you've learned that are probably useful. That said, like beginner's mind can be such an asset in this ecosystem and in this world, because really, again, like if it comes back to the sort of Mike Maples framework of like insight, and like inflection point, a beginner's mind is maybe primed to see things differently than sort of practitioners who've been in the ecosystem forever. And so I think like with the risk comes the benefit of a lot more independent thinking. What was the second part of your question? It was, okay, yeah.
There's another question in the back, I think.
Uh-oh, Jean-Claude's part of the family. You teeing me up for a softball, dude? Perfect.
I was going to ask, what's the biggest benefit for being part of the family?
Oh, good. He should answer that question. Yeah.
I've had the great pleasure of being a part of the Dormer Fund community for 6 years now, 2 years as an investing partner and then 4 years as an alum. I've also had the great pleasure of seeing Dormer Fund evolve under your leadership, Molly. I'm curious, when you think about Dormer Fund in 5 years, 10 years, what does it look like and how is it different than today? Is it a traditional seed fund? Are you competing with YC? What is the model?
I'm not coming for your lunch, Jean-Claude. So Jean-Claude was on our team when he was an undergrad at Berkeley, and now works with another Dormer Fund alum, Chauncey Hamilton, at an amazing fund called XYZ. So big fan of what they do, and they do lead seed rounds. So look, I think in terms of thinking about the future growth of DRF, there's a lot of ground to be covered, right? I think as Sonali and I were just talking about, we only just broke out of our 4 core cities, right, a couple of years ago. And so I think there's still a lot of ground to cover in the United States. We just added our first Canadian student to the team. So we have someone from Waterloo now. So we're starting, talk about a university with a culture of building. Waterloo is on fire. So I think there's a lot of room for growth in that area. I think the other thing that we've got some room for growth in terms of how we help our founders. So I think we probably have some growth in terms of the size of our fund. I think we have some growth in terms of the size of the capital that we're sort of investing in our companies. And then I think there's also some programmatic opportunities for us in terms of how we help our founders grow as a cohort and as individuals. But when I think about what we can do next, I think the thing that I'm most excited about is that there is this and a lot of people talk about community, and most of them are full of it, to be quite honest. Like, DRF is very deeply involved. Like, the fact that there is a bunch of alums in the room, I hope, is a great testament to that. But once you're DRF, you truly are Dormer Fund for life. And so we sort of joke about it internally, but it's true. And so the big question for me is, how do we unlock that opportunity? And so, does that look like more investing opportunities in our alumni, with our alumni? Are we thinking about, do we offer some kind of accelerator in the future? I mean, there's so many different paths that we can go to sort of unlock what we've done and what we've built. I think we're at this stage as a fund where we've built something really enviable, which is a flywheel, right? And I think most funds try really hard to build that. And so now what we're trying to do is capitalize on that opportunity that we've built. So.
I think we have time for one more question. I see one right here.
I feel like there's not a conversation I've had with founders that doesn't involve the word AI these days.
Yeah.
I would really love to hear how the founder expectations have changed from your perspective. What do you expect in founders now that they have access to all these tools and capabilities?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I think that, first of all, I expect that a question I would get from LPs, so folks that invest in venture funds, is what percentage of your companies are AI companies? And I think really it's 100%, because at this point it's very uncommon to find a business that has no part of their business that isn't touched by some piece of that ecosystem, right? I mean, I think whether it's just their sales team is ripping outbounds with the help of Claude or whatever, there's some piece of the ecosystem or some piece of the business that touches it, right? So I think that's I think removing the idea of like AI company, like they're all kind of AI companies, but but there are ones that are sort of more core to that that infrastructure, and so that's those I think would maybe be AI companies at this point. But I think that there is a lot you can do as a small scrappy team too, right? Like part of the reason that Dorm Room Fund got started is that in 2012, when we were first getting started, like you didn't have to spin up like server racks anymore, right? You could spin up an AWS instance and like start a business, right? Start a software company. And so I think, and that really lowered the barrier to entry in terms of who could build and who thought of themselves as a founder in a really cool way. And so I think with the AI tools that exist today, whether that's on the, sort of like large language side, or whether that's sort of like the, the code editors that exist like Cursor, right? Or, all of these products that have turned really technical things into like almost no code solutions, it allows founders to get a lot farther, before they're going out to raise capital. And I think like one thing that I always try to remind founders is that like you don't want to raise before you have to, right? Because once you get on the venture capital treadmill, you're always working for that next fundraise, right? And hitting the sort of next set of metrics. And so, I think my hunch is that it's going to contribute to what Sonali was talking about, which is that like, already we see that like what used to be, Series A used to be that you had to have $1 million in ARR to raise Series A. Now it's like, that's like not even enough to get Series A investors out of bed, right? That's like table stakes, right? And so I think, and so as a result of that, you see it moving downstream. And so seed, you like really need to have some, real revenue behind you. And so pre-seed is now, we're seeing companies with like real working products and not just like Figma mock-ups, right? And so I think it'll be interesting to see how that continues to progress. And, I think it sort of points back to that, I think it was Sam Altman and his like, first $1 billion company that's one team, one person, right? Like the company that I was mentioning earlier, who has this astronomical, fundraise that they just did and are reaching these amazing amounts of users. They're like 10 or 12 people, it's crazy what's possible. So I think it's an exciting thing.
Molly, we thank you so very much. It's been such a great conversation. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time. And thank you all for being here. This has been such a lovely night.
Thank you so much, Sonali. It was so much fun.
Thank you so much.